Greetings, everybody. This is Brian King. Welcome to another episode of The Mindset King. I am privileged today to be joined by James Roberts, who is from the UK. Love that we can reach out to these international brilliant folks and bring them to you. And James has a very inspirational and compelling story that I just knew I had to bring you. He's a two-time Paralympian, which should give you a little context here. He's the host of his own podcast, which he will tell us about. And he's also an online personal trainer. And that's something that's particularly exciting to me as somebody that has MS. It's very difficult to get out to the gym. So seeing people that are doing more things online these days to help folks like me get and stay in shape is very wonderful to see. So let's get down to business here, because I know James has a lot to share and a lot to teach you. So James, man, thank you so much for coming on today.
That's my pleasure, Brian.
So you are a two-time Paralympian, and some people may know what that means, but a lot of people might not. So Paralympics is different from the traditional Olympic Games. Can you give us some idea of what the main differences are?
Well, Brian, that's a good question. The actual term Paralympics is meant to be parallel to the Olympics. I think where the differences maybe go beyond that is obviously the multitude of disabilities that the Paralympics make up. So I was talking to a guest on my podcast, not too recently, about it. Maybe that's what is maybe a turn off for some people to maybe want to watch it, because with it having that complexity of disabilities, and we'll use the example of track and field, because you associate it with the Olympics of where the one event with male and female, whereas with the Paralympics, you may have upwards of, say, and this is just off the top of my head, about 5 different events within classification. So it kind of maybe distorts some people's perceptions of it. So I hope I answered your question there.
So people with disabilities compete in the Paralympics.
Yes.
Now, when you say disabilities plural, what kind of people have you seen compete in the Paralympics over the years?
Well, the easy ones would be wheelchair users, which is obviously going back to its very foundations of starting as a movement. You've got people with cerebral palsy, visually impaired, obviously people similar disabilities to me, the amputees, and what they class as les autres. So it's kind of a one they lump together. Everybody, you could say, everybody else that's left. I don't think I'm missing any others. I apologize for anybody who's within the Paralympic movement if I have forgotten any disabilities. I can't think of anything else. Obviously, you've got also the mentally disabled, which came back in, what game was it been? I think 2008 or 2012. They got reintroduced because of the cheating that happened at the Sydney Games back in 2000. So they got expelled from the actual movement, and they've been reintroduced with new tests and all that. And I think that is all the disabilities I can think of. There's probably 1 or 2 that I'm missing. I apologize for anybody who's associated with those ones.
The reality is, I imagine the list is pretty darn long, because there are so many ways that you can be imperfect in this world.
Very true.
You know, whether it be physical or mentally or psychologically. And what's beautiful about the Paralympics is that you can still show up, compete, and be a model to the rest of the world of just how much you can push through.
Mm-hmm.
And I appeared on a podcast this morning, and it was a similar conversation about talking about our strengths, our challenges, and what do we do to push beyond those challenges as opposed to just succumbing to what seem to be the obvious limitations. So you being a 2-time Paralympian, what brought you to the Paralympics?
That's an interesting question there, Brian. It was actually a coach of mine. Oh gosh, we're going back about over 15 years ago now. I actually started an able-bodied swim club back out in Belgium because my parents were in the military. And at the time, the coach I perceived it as maybe you could even say an insult to some degree because how she worded it and how I look at it now, a little bit more positive light. But at the time, I think because I was a teenager, I perceived it very negatively. And what she actually said, and this is paraphrasing a little bit, is had you thought about doing disability sport? But because of my disability, in the grand scheme of things, not being that much of an impairment vis-a-vis what any, like say, somebody in a wheelchair or something like that, I could still compete against my able-bodied peers within reason. So I was kind of, say, a little bit shocked, a little bit flabbergasted, kind of didn't know what to say. I kind of said, I don't say I shrugged it off, but I kind of took it on the chin and say, okay. I went home to speak to my parents, and we do discuss it from time to time, even to this day. And they were a little bit more shocked in terms of, okay, that's kind of a dig at my son because...
So they were hit a little bit harder with the suggestion than you were.
How I speak to my parents now, I would say that was the case. I think probably back then, I probably was of a similar notion. You're thinking, well, and I do talk about it from a story perspective on my website, that it was probably, I could look at it in a negative light. Maybe because it wasn't in the media spotlight as much as it is into the present day, I probably looked down upon it. And okay, realistically, I know I'm not going to get to the heights of, say, the Olympics or the elite level in able-bodied sport. However, I didn't see my disability as a limitation to be able to compete at, well, that's a relatively low league kind of swimming that I actually had to compete on a monthly basis. So I took it on board. I did run with it, and I was fortunate.
No pun intended.
Yeah, very true. Because I think it helped because I was overseas. We had a Belgian coach running the team at the time, and he was also coaching another team within the Belgian setup. He knew of a coach with a disability himself. He got me his contact details. I think within a space of, I'm going to say about 6 months, I went down to their training. This would be about summertime. I think they thought I'd be just the average Joe Blogs, as you would say, off the street. Did the training session. My mom was with their team management on the side. And what she told me when we got in the car afterwards is that their eyes lit up. And to kind of put that into perspective, Brian, of the top 3-4 swimmers that they had in that program, 3 of us went on to compete at the Paralympics.
So tell us a little bit about the disability that compelled your then swimming coach to say, hey, James, why don't you try out this Paralympic thing?
What you mean as in the medical term and how it affects me in that light? Mm-hmm. Well, the medical term for it, Brian, is femoral dysplasia. I kind of lump it in and say it's an amputation. It's not really an amputation. It's easier to try and not have to explain to, say, the random person on the street because they know what with us having so many wars nowadays, that is not an uncommon sight. So you say an amputee, you know exactly what to do. But to kind of cut that into context, see if I can get this right now. I don't have a femur. I've got a small tibia, small fibula. So in essence, I have the bottom half of my leg, so below the knee, but no knee joint. And that is attached to my hip socket. And then also hip socket itself doesn't have, but most people would know, it's a ball and socket. I've got the ball of the hip, but no actual socket joint coming off the pelvis. So it's floating around in muscle. So
the sound of it is this one or both legs?
This is my left leg, so just one leg.
Your left leg didn't develop properly.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So it's much smaller. It has some of the features, but not enough to really be functional for you.
I would agree with that.
Okay. So with that, you got one leg that's working for you, like your typical person would have, another leg that's not what it could be,
Hmm.
and yet you were still competing with typical peers in the swimming pool who had both their legs,
Yeah, exactly.
and you were holding your own.
Um, well, if I'm fair, if I'm not so judgmental to myself, I would agree with that sentiment. Probably as I got older, that became a little bit of a disadvantage, but that was a sport where my family thought, well, the water, I would say, is an equalizer, but compared to other sports, I'm not as so much at a disadvantage.
Okay. So you did better than average, to say the least.
Well, if you look on reflection, yeah.
Okay, I
But
hope so.
of the team, probably team's history on that installation, yeah, to reach the heights of even national prowess, I would say that's probably me. I won't say boasting, but maybe bigging myself
Come on,
up.
do a little self bragging here. You're allowed.
I would say that you talk to alumni, people who've gone back and gone to be in the capacity of actually working at the installation. They kind of say, well, you've kind of punched above and beyond. Well, if I'm honest to myself, I probably had aspirations as probably any even disabled or able-bodied individual as a kid who wants to do something in sport, has the aspirations of reaching the highest level possible. That was a goal of mine. I think as I got older and got to the realization, okay, the disability is going to hold me back to some extent. What can I do else? And obviously, as we were talking about, that coach kind of, well, threw me a lifeline, so to speak, and kind of has directed me where my life has gone.
So tell me a little bit more, because you saw yourself competing in one context where, as far as you could tell, there weren't any monumental differences. There was that physical distinction between you and the people you were competing against, but you saw yourself amongst your equals, amongst your peers, right? And you were competing, you were doing well, and you saw yourself succeeding in that world. And now your coach comes along and says, hey, James, what about this Paralympic thing? And you took it as an ego shot,
Mm-hmm.
right? Who are you to tell me I should try out for this Paralympic thing? And then your parents heard it and they had a similar response, right? So how do you make that transition? Now you've kind of dipped your foot in the pool of the Paralympics, so to speak. Your mom has talked to the coach a little bit, and then you begin to warm up to the idea and say, maybe this is for me.
I think once we'd let it settle, Brian, I think it's like, okay, what have I got to lose? Really, I could still go back to well, I still did the able-bodied sport alongside it. Oof, gosh,
So you were multitasking a bit here.
I was doing both because what to kind of put that into context, Brian. A lot of the say least impaired people within the Paralympic movement are going to train in able-bodied clubs anyway because they're going to try and probably extend that ability that they've got and not.
That's a very good point. It compels you to keep your game real strong if you're
So,
up against the more able-bodied people. That makes sense.
so a lot of the times when you hear of disability clubs, I would say more so within swimming, you would think of, say, the more severely disabled, mentally disabled, whereas the ones who are physically impaired are going to try and stay within the able-bodied setup because they're going to be pushed, I won't say further, but they're going to be put with, say, people of a similar level from an able-bodied perspective. And I think it's a win-win for both because you could perceive it from the able-bodied perspective, and that's probably where the jokes come up sometimes. They don't want to be beaten by somebody that's, or you could say, like you said, quote unquote, inferior, so to speak. I think it is a driving force, I think, from an individual, from my perspective. Okay, let's try and beat you because it's an ego trip for you. It's going to make you, I think, depends on the individual now. It's going to make you work harder, but it's going to make me work harder as well. So I think it's a win-win from that sense. And I think you don't generally see, you do see it occasionally that they'll do see the crossover. But I think if we more specifically, when I came back to the UK, I think it's a win-win for the able-bodied club. A lot of the teams I swam for are not always going to get an individual to say, gosh, we're trying to think from the top of my head, say Olympic trials or Paralympic trials, we could say probably set aside. But to make it to that level is very, very difficult. So I put that kind of the spotlight on the club, so to speak. So they get a little bit of the media spotlight. Okay, I did very well as well, so that helps. So that puts them in publications, so they kind of get a name for themselves as well. Okay, I wasn't with the club in that I was talking about for very long, but that's obviously because I was progressing up the ladder, and then also I had to look with regard to my career longevity and obviously where the best facilities are. So obviously I had to move. So that had a bearing on my further education with college and university. So I had to have in mind, well, where is an Olympic-sized swimming pool? Where is a good program? And I had to base that around, as well as where is a good institution for my academics. So I'd kind of balance the two. I think the sport took a front-end seat to the academics, and the academics probably towed along in tow. Okay, I probably, in hindsight, probably looking back now, I probably picked the best institution for me from both.
Well, one thing that you mentioned a bit ago that I don't want to leave without some exploration. You mentioned that when you were competing against able-bodied peers, that one of the incentives for them was, hey, I don't want to lose to the guy who's perceived as less than, okay? That is something, that's a stereotype, that's a judgment that a lot of us face in this world, and I imagine you faced it as well, is how do you approach that subject to really impress upon people around you that, hey, we're both human beings, we're fighting to do the best we can with what we've got. Don't you for 1 second see me as anything less than an equal. And I don't mean approaching it in a confrontational way, but much more of a, hey, let's have a discussion about this.
Well, I think with that, Brian, I think because I've seen my limitations as less so an hindrance, more of an adaptation to the environment that I'm in, I've never seen it as confrontational. Okay, that's somebody's point of view. That's fine. We can have a discussion about it. You perceive me as possibly lesser than you. If we go back to probably back then as a teenager, I've got to put, I don't say point to prove, but I will want to beat you, not out of spite, but to make it worse for you. Whereas I think maybe as I got older, if you see me lesser than you, it's you that's got the problem, not me. It's maybe your attitude needs to change to how you perceive people. Okay, like you put it upon, everybody has got their limitations, their quote unquote disabilities that they're going to face. You can't always see them. So I think we shouldn't be so quick to be so judgmental of anybody, because everybody's have to come, be it an adversity now or in the future. So to be so narrow-minded, so to speak, is probably not a good way to be.
Absolutely. Beautiful way that you put that. And my disability has come later in life. You know, I was very able-bodied. I did martial arts for many years. I loved hiking with my family and exploring nature trails. And in the past 4 years, with the MS and the way that it's moving, wow, now that's a water jug, man. For those of you who can't see it, he just took a sip out of something that was his massive water jug. Very, very impressive. Way to stay hydrated, James. But yeah, in the past 4 years, my ability to really move around and have stamina has really declined. And it has taught me some powerful things in terms of vulnerability and humility and exploring what it means to let go of those more able-bodied means and embrace accommodations like wheelchair and using the motorized cart in the grocery store, where before I could just truck along and hurry and move at my own pace. And it's a very different experience than somebody who has always had that challenge. Mm-hmm. And one thing I'm curious about is you mentioned that when you're competing, you want to make sure that your club gets attention and recognition as well, which is a beautiful thing, because that says that it's not just about you, it's also about the people that supported you in getting there. And you'll see a lot of the gymnastics or the Olympic swimming, and you see the people, you hear about their endorsements, you see the commercials, you never hear a darn thing about where did they practice every single day. Maybe you hear something about who their coach was, but it's an afterthought. Mm-hmm. It's usually all about the athlete. So I love hearing the fact that you want to put your success in context and say, I was supported to get here. This didn't happen in a vacuum. And I want these people to get some recognition as well.
Well, I think it's maybe, in that sense, Brian, I think that's maybe where I was brought up. Well, I think parents don't get the recognition from sport a lot of the time, because if I put this into context, we had a welcome home ceremony. I'm trying to think which one it would have been. I think the last one for 2012. And it annoyed my mother because they recognized, say, the volunteers that were a part of the actual games, but they didn't actually thank the parents. I think it took me a time to wrap my head around it. But she has a point, because, okay, the volunteers, we wouldn't be there without the volunteers as athletes, but we wouldn't be on the road to where we got to if it wasn't for the dedication of our parents. Because sometimes along that journey, they're going to have more dedication than us. So I say, I was fortunate. I didn't have to get up at, say, 4 or 5 in the morning to go to practice, to go swimming. I did have to do that when I was at university. Okay, it wasn't 4 in the morning, but it was 5 o'clock. So my parents have to endure that. But I think that is maybe an advantage I had of growing up on a military installation. That is kind of the morale and welfare of the extended family is there. So our practice was after school. So that in the all seriousness of what a swimmer has to endure, most of that I didn't have to do in that. Gosh, what would it been from the age of 11 till I was 19? So 8 years, I maybe had to do the crazy training sessions for maybe, 6 months out of a 8-year career.
I'm so glad you mentioned the parents, because one thing, and I bring this up a lot and with what I share with my community, is how much of a role my support system plays in my ability to continue to show up the way I do. Whether it be my kids, my wife, my mentors, my friends, my colleagues, all those who support me, especially on my harder days, mm-hmm. are what keep me going. I don't just wake up in the morning and I'm all full of piss and vinegar and it's just coming from some internal source. It doesn't work like that. You know, we often need to lean on the very people that believe in us and see a vision for what we can accomplish and say, hey, James, how can I back you up, man? Or, all right, James, come on, get out of bed. I'm going to go drive through to get a coffee and you're going to go swim. Yeah. You know, you got your tired parent who's waking up to get you moving. And without all of those players doing their specific role in the mix, you wouldn't have got there. So it literally takes a village. It takes a community to help us succeed with or without a disability.
Well, I also, and I put that into another perspective as well, Brian. I did an article for Disability Sport Wales over here, which is a massive organisation from a sports perspective in Britain. Obviously, I wrote it all the spiel of how, you could say my life is slightly different to say other athletes, the trial and tribulations, the ups and downs. I've been dropped from the national program in swimming to making the Paralympics in rowing, and then obviously making my second games in volleyball. But to kind of finish off the article, and what we touched upon with the parents, I thanked, be it all the clubs I've ever represented, my parents, the coaches I've had by name, our performance director who kind of steered me through from sport to sport, and kind of being ever present to kind of thank them for, you could say, put me on the right path, and kind of getting me to the height that people believed I could do, and kind of saying, okay, you kind of had a aspiration of what I could achieve. Well, okay, it didn't materialize in swimming, which a lot of coaches thought it might do. I've reached my potential. Okay, it happened to be another sport, but I have got to where you thought I could get to.
So you thank everybody in a way for saying, you believed in me, you supported me, you provided a venue, and I want you to know how grateful I am for that. And for some people, that's one of the biggest accomplishments in their life, is to be appreciated by somebody that went the distance like you did. So it's beautiful that you were able to do that for them. And I know there's a lot more to your story. We didn't get into a lot of it, but here's the good news. You have a social media presence that people can connect to. You've got a website, you've got a podcast. And what I want you to do is, when we're done here talking, send me the links to all of those things. I'm going to add them to the show notes of our conversation, and I want to compel everybody listening or watching, seek out James, find out what he's about, learn more about his mindset, his story, the services he provides, listen to his podcast, and help him become a further inspiration to you and the folks in your life. So thank you, James, so much for being on the show today. I appreciate you sharing the story, and man, keep up the awesome work.
It's been my absolute pleasure, Brian, speaking with you today.
Likewise, man. And everybody out there listening, thank you so much for tuning in to the Mindset King. Please share this and other episodes with people that you know could benefit from it, and help us continue to do our work here of showing people that no matter how difficult life is, with the right mindset, you can do more than you ever imagined. Take care. We'll catch you next time.